I have one sacred text. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil. Henry David Thoreau, 1846, on Walden. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the roots. Call him the roots striker. Okay, so here's the argument I want to give you today. Rasmussen last July reported that 46% of Americans think most in Congress are corrupt. You know, and I know, that the American people are wrong about that. Congress is not filled with the likes of Rod Blagojevich. It's completely wrong to imagine the institution filled with people who are thinking about themselves over the Republic. I agree with my colleague Dennis Thompson, who says that the integrity and competence of this institution is as high as it has ever been, and it is extremely high. Maybe a little higher before 2010, but okay, still very high. It is the highest that it has ever been. And anyone who says that the institution is filled with a bunch of crooks knows nothing about how the institution functions. But there is an important sense of corruption that I think is true of the institution, predicated of the institution. Not a corruption of the people in the institution, a corruption of the institution. The framers of our Constitution gave us what they called a republic. And by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, as Federalist 52 puts it, they meant an institution that would have a branch of government that would be dependent upon the people alone. That's your branch. Dependent upon the people alone. So here's their model. They have the people, they have the Congress. I do my own slides. That's cool the way that bounces like that, right? They have the people, they have the Congress. That relationship creates a dependency which is to be exclusive. But here's the problem. Congress has evolved here a different dependence. Not just a dependence upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders. When I finished a book last July, I reviewed every single research project that tried to estimate how you spend your time. And they range between 30 and 70% of your time spent raising money to get back into Congress or to get your party back into power. And as any human would, when you do that, you develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what you do might affect your ability to raise money. You become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, not on issues 1 to 10, but 11 to 2,000, constantly adjusting your views in light of what you know might raise money. Leslie Byrne, Democrat from Virginia, when she first came to Congress, said she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone, because, obviously, the funders are not the people. 0.26% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional campaign. 0.05% of Americans max out in a congressional campaign. 0.01, 1 out of 10,000 spend more than $10,000 in an election cycle. The Occupy Wall Street people are proud of their "We are the 99% slogan. It's bad marketing. They are either the 99.74% or the 99.95% or the 99.99% who don't have access or influence in this institution of government because they are not the funders. Now, in a very obvious sense, one that I think even the Supreme Court will eventually recognize, this is a kind of corruption. It is not brown paper bag corruption with cash secreted to one member of the other. It's not Rod Blagojevich corruption. It doesn't violate any law. But it is a corruption because it's a dependence other than the dependence upon the people. It conflicts with that dependence. It is dependence corruption because this wrong dependence corrupts the way the institution functions. Now, this corruption has an effect. Political scientists have a little trouble measuring it, but here's what there's no uncertainty about. Americans believe money buys results in Congress. Americans believe this. In a poll I did for my book, 75% of Americans believe this. When I did the poll, it was a little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you when you controlled Congress, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here is the thing we all agree about as Americans. Money buys results in Congress. And that leads to number 2. This belief erodes trust. Gallup last year reported 11% of Americans have confidence in Congress. Their update to that report said it's 12% progress, but then the New York Times, ABC said the number is 9%. And we have to recognize the significance of that number, 9%. There were certainly more people who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in the institution of Congress today. And that produces number 3, low trust erodes participation. Rock the Vote, registering young voters and turning them out to vote, who turned out the largest number of young voters ever in the history of this country in 2008. In 2010, discovered a significant number of their voters were not going to show up. So they asked them, why weren't they going to show up? And the number 1 reason by far, 2-to-1 over the second highest reason, was no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. So, Americans are plainly wrong. The Blagojeviches fill the institution. This institution is filled with decent, honest, hardworking souls working for what they believe in, who went to Congress to do good in their own view of what good means. But the institution which you inherited, the crown jewel of our republic, Article 1 in our Constitution, has suffered because of the economy of influence you have allowed to evolve. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. So what do we do about this? If the problem is the system, not the individuals, but the system, if it's a systemic problem, and the systemic problem is the funders are not the people, the systemic solution is to make the funders the people. To give Congress away, to fund without Faust, without seeming to sell your souls the way Americans believe you sell your souls, and thereby alienating America. And the one way to do this, and I increasingly believe the only way to do this, is to openly and strongly and firmly say we need publicly funded public elections. Or I can tell you the polling is better for calling it citizen-funded campaigns, but whatever. Publicly funded public elections to replace a system of large dollar-funded campaigns with small dollar-funded campaigns, following the model perhaps of Arizona or Maine or Connecticut, a system where you can opt into accepting small dollar contributions only, and the system then amplifies those contributions so you can afford to run a successful campaign, never turning to the 0.05%. Now, there are many ways to do this. I'm a supporter of the Fair Elections Now Act, which came close in the House in 2010 to passing, an act which exploded excitement around the country. Here's a sign I found on the internet. You would be surprised, I think, to recognize this little slogan supporting this bill was on a Tea Party news site. On the left and the right, there is support for the idea that we need small dollar funded elections. Now, in my book, I've looked at this problem in light of what I know the criticism from the right is of small dollar funded elections. I've developed a little bit different version. Let me just introduce it quickly to you. Let's call this the Grant and Franklin Project. So you have to stipulate with me that every single American contributes, quote unquote, contributes at least $50 to the federal treasury, not necessarily in income taxes, but in taxes. So under the Grant and Franklin Project, what we do is we rebate the first $50 that everyone pays in the form of a democracy voucher. And with that voucher, people can then contribute the voucher or part of the voucher to any candidate for Congress they want if that candidate chooses to voluntarily opt into a system where they will fund their campaigns only with vouchers plus contributions limited at $100 a citizen. So $50 vouchers, $100 contributions, that's Grant and Franklin. And if they don't allocate their voucher, then the money gets rebated to their political party. And if they're not a member of a party, then we rebate it to some democracy-supporting activity. Now here's the point. $50 a voter is $7 billion. 2010, the total amount raised by everyone was $1.8 billion. So that's 3 times the total amount raised in 2010 without even talking about the $100 contribution. That means that's real money to make it possible for people to opt into a system where they don't need to ever look to the 0.05% to fund their campaigns. Now, if we had a system, just imagine a system where a majority, a significant majority, in Connecticut, in the first year of their program, 78% of elected representatives opted into their small dollar funded system and succeeded. If we had such a program where a significant majority of congressmen opted into this system of taking small dollars only, then here's what we would buy with that. We would buy the ability for all Americans to believe, as all Americans want to believe, that when Congress did something stupid, it's either because there are too many Republicans or because there are too many Democrats, but not because of the money. Because we would have removed the source of this cynicism by producing a system where money could not be driving results in a way that anybody could credibly believe. Now, would public funding alone be enough? 2 years ago, after Citizens United was decided, I still believed the Fair Elections Now Act or a version of it would have been enough. But I think the last 2 years have taught us that it's not enough. Public funding alone will not be enough because we've entered a very unstable period. Let's call it the age of the super PAC. I don't mean the happy, cool bear kind of super PAC. I mean a very dark kind of super PAC. And here's Tony Soprano just to give you the right frame for the super PAC. And I've seen and listened to members of your caucus and former members of your caucus who've explained to me how these super PACs now change the dynamic in Washington. I was on a panel with former Senator Evan Bayh, and he was responding to an academic skepticism about whether there's any evidence that money buys results in Washington. And he kind of rolled his eyes and he said, "You have no idea how the world has changed since Citizens United." He said, "The single most important thing an incumbent worries about now, an incumbent who used to be the baron on the Hill, who had all the money, who had all the public support, the thing the incumbent worries about most is that 30 days before the election, someone's going to come in and drop $500,000 or $1 million on the other side. And when that happens, what do? Because you can't turn to your largest contributors. By definition, they've maxed out. So who do you turn to? What do you do in response? The only thing you can do, and this is a little bit metaphorical, but essentially what Senator Bayh was saying, is you buy super PAC insurance. Super PAC insurance so that when a bomb gets dropped on one side, you know there's a bomb that can drop on the other. And how do you buy insurance? Well, you pay your premium in advance. And how do you pay your premium in advance? Well, you meet with lots of people who tell you things like, "Senator, we'd like to help you, but we can only support people who are at 80% of our approval rating." And then you know what you need to do to have the super PAC insurance you will need to guarantee that when the bomb is dropped, there are bombs on the other side. Changing the barons into the vassals. Changing the people in power into the people who are constantly begging for power to make sure they can keep their jobs. And the critical thing is here, without the super PAC spending a dollar, they can begin to produce a world in which they call shots in a way they never had the capacity to do before. This is what Citizens United gave us. This is the dynamic that unlimited corporate spending has given us. And I think we need to recognize that dynamic, and what that means is that we're going to need more than simple public funding. What you're going to need is both public funding and an amendment to the Constitution, but an amendment that responds to the problem. Not an amendment that is some geeky, sexy, corporations are not persons amendments. I understand the political appeal to that, but that changes nothing. An amendment that responds to the problem, and the problem is the dominant role that independent expenditures can play. So an amendment like this that would say that Congress has the power to limit, but I don't think you should ever have the power to ban, to limit independent political expenditures, at least within a window around the elections. Not to ban, everyone should be free, whether individuals, corporations, foreigners, or dolphins, to say what they want about the political process. But we need a way to make sure that when they say what they want to say, they don't say it in a way that leads members to constantly think, how do I shape-shift, not only to get campaign contributions, but also to get the right kind of independent expenditures in my district. Both of these changes are essential. And if we had both of those changes, I think you would make it possible for America to believe in your institution again. But is it possible to get both of these together? I mean, as you know, you could get public funding tomorrow. Even the Supreme Court would uphold Fair Elections Now Act, or the version of that that I have proposed, the Granted Franklin Project. It's simply a vote in Congress signed by a president. But is it possible to imagine Congress doing this? Because I can tell you in the more than 400 talks I have given around the country in the last 4 years about this issue, most people think the problem here is not hard to see. The solution here is not hard to imagine. What's hard, maybe impossibly hard, is imagining the insiders enacting this solution. As one of your members described the institution to me, Congress, Capitol Hill, has become a kind of farm league for K Street. Members, staffers, and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model focused on their life after government. Their life as a lobbyist. Public Citizen said between 1998 and 2004, 50% of senators retired to lobbying, 42% of members of the House. So the public thinks everybody depends upon this system surviving. And so the public asks, if everyone depends upon the system surviving, how can we ever imagine people within the system changing it? And I think the answer is we have to give up the kind of simple either-or. Either the insiders will change it or they won't. That's not the only option here. Because in addition to the left and the right on the inside, there's also an inside and an outside in American politics today. And what this movement needs is an outsider politics too. Not a politics of politicians, but a politics of citizen politicians. People who aren't running for anything. I am in that camp. I am not running for anything, I promise. I'm not running for anything, but I am running to change a system that has corroded this democracy. A kind of alliance politics, an alliance that brings together people who have radically different views. Think the alliance that won World War II, Roosevelt sitting next to a Stalin, not the alliance that tried to win World War II. Or for us, think about the alliance of people like this and people like that. An alliance. A group of people who don't have a common end, but who might have a common enemy. And I suggest they can see as their common enemy a system that corrupts an institution. And they can be drawn to see the root to this system and become root strikers. Now, when I tried to convince Jon Stewart of this, he didn't like root strikers. He said I ought to call them Batmen. All right, well, whether it's Batmen or root strikers, the same idea applies. People who are trying to convince Americans that there is something that blocks the democracy from functioning for both the left and the right. And the picture of that block is this picture. A government no longer dependent upon the people alone, but increasingly dependent upon funders as well as the people. And that root is a corruption. Now that's what outsider politics could do here. But what outsiders need is insiders. They need leadership from the insiders. They need something to aim for, something to rally around, something to inspire them that this kind of change could happen. What they need is you. And as a Democrat, I want to say you with a Democratic button on Uncle Sam's coat. What they need is you as insiders to inspire them. With big ideas, not small ideas. With bold ideas, not necessarily with realistic ideas. With things not that we can do, but with things that need to be done. Because in the next couple years, we have to build the movement of outsiders who demand that people in Washington make this change. And what you can do today, and there's a lot you can do today, I don't think is going to be enough. And if we're going to inspire an outside the Beltway movement, if we're going to inspire these outsiders, you need to talk about what would be enough, so they have a reason to get up off their couch and fight for the change that would make it possible for all Americans to believe in their government again. I'm sure many of you know the story Ben Franklin carried from the convention in September 1787, stopped by in the street of Philadelphia by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" Franklin responds, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic, a representative democracy, a government dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic. And you may be innocent in bringing that loss about. We could call it Newt's problem. You may not be responsible. But you are responsible for changing it. And you need to act. You need to inspire us so that we all, insiders and outsiders, can fight to get it back." Thank you very much.